Well, I want to start off today by thanking everyone for uh, attending the presentation today. The FEI Tampa Bay chapter welcomes all members, sponsors, and guests to this event, and hope the content is useful to you in the future. First, I wanted to take a minute and wish everyone Happy New Year. I think the last time I was online was at the end of November. And we were hoping to put on our holiday event in December. Unfortunately, with the concerns on counts, etc., we ended up canceling that event. But at this point in time, the board has spent many days in discussion, and we believe that we're ready to go back to in-person meetings. So we are looking to have our first in-person event in March. So please look for correspondence related to that event and the location. We had hoped to be able to make it a hybrid event where we could have people online as well as in person. And unfortunately, we're still trying to figure out the technology aspects of that. But we do understand that some individuals will not be comfortable attending in person. But if you are, we encourage you to go ahead and make it to the event. We believe it's going to be on the St. Pete side of the bay this time. Also wanted to mention the fact that if you could please save the date in your calendar for our fall charitable event, which is the 2021 Sporting Clays event. It's September 24th at the Tampa Bay Sporting Clays. For anybody that's attended this event in the past, it's fantastic. It's small groups, it's outside, and we think it's a pretty optimal event to be holding in a COVID type year. But from what we understand, there's quite a few groups that are actively doing events at the Tampa Bay Sporting Clays, and it's going very well. So they've had some really good positive events recently, and I think that that outdoors opportunity is a positive one. And the March in-person event will be outdoors as well. In addition to that, we have our holiday social. Already reserved the date for December 1st at the Tampa Yacht and Country Club. Once again, also one of our most popular events. So please save the date on your calendars, and hope you'll be able to be there. At this point in time, I'd like to turn the microphone over to Denise, and she can talk to you about the polling questions and continuing education.
Hi, everybody. This session has been approved for 1 CPE credit in business management and organization. There are a couple of caveats. I'll be launching a series of polling questions throughout the presentation. There'll be 5 of them, and you must respond to 4. You also must hang on for the entire presentation. I'll just pop up a polling question now quickly to let you see what it looks like. And if you want to go ahead and answer this one, this is just kind of a fun one. I'll give everybody about 30 seconds. And this way you'll have a bonus one in case you go for a drink of water or something and you miss one later in the presentation.
Thank you, Denise. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce everyone to RGP. RGP is a company that specializes in business transformations, finance and accounting, risk and compliance, technology and digital, and COVID-19 capabilities. Today our speakers are Ian Burnett and Kristen Darby. Ian is the Vice President of Internal Audit and Compliance, Advisory and Project Services, and Kristen is the Vice President of Business Agility for RGP. We thank you both for being here today and bringing this presentation to our team. So I will now turn it over to them.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. We're excited to share. You know, we at RGP are always helping our clients with transformation, but one of the things that brought us to this place is that concept of using Agile and agility to help organizations think and work a little differently. So we'll go through how we've applied that to Agile Audit and where we find success and maturity. We got some pre-questions, so we'll kind of sprinkle those in, and feel free, each of the participants, to add questions in the chat. Both Ian and I are here, and we also have a couple other folks on the phone to help if we have some questions that so we have the right expertise on the phone to answer the questions. So with that, Ian, you want to introduce yourself or say anything before we get started?
Sure, Kristen. As said, I'm Ian Burnett, VP Internal Audit and Compliance, and excited to bring you this content today. So I support clients in all different industries in a national role here. So we're very excited about this material, and let's dive in, Kristen.
Sure. All right. So most of the time when I come to talk to folks about Agile and agility, I get the same question. It's vague, it's conceptual, it's things of this nature, but agility is one of those interesting words. And, you know, the reality of it is, you saw it in the announcement, if you do a search for business agility in Google, you get 85 million responses. If you do a focus search in business agility in Google, you get 2.5. This is a concept that a lot of people are talking about. And part of the reason is that it's a very mature piece. And in the age of COVID, everyone is constantly struggling to rethink and reinvigorate and change the way they do business. What Ian and I are going to share with you today is sort of what does that actually mean to the business and what does that actually mean in the context of audit. So we're going to dive into the sort of what is Agile, and I'm going to talk a little bit about agility and Agile. And Ian's going to drive that home with how does that apply to Agile Audit and the what of Agile Audit. So we're going to cover both sides of the coin today. You know, Agile's not new. I think it's one of those things that I've been a passionate Agilist for a decade or more now, helping organizations through this transformation. But the reality of it, this is the aggregation and the culmination of years and years and years of really tried and true and tested techniques and tools that have been brought together and now started to mature into something new. So if you think about Agile, it is got its underpinnings and its beginnings in Lean, all the way back, you know, pre-1990. And Lean went from manufacturing and matured, and people started applying Lean principles to construction and quality and supply chain. Then software hit. We had the software revolution, and they started using the same principles. And, you know, February 11th is now the 20-year anniversary of the Agile Manifesto. So this, again, they took all of those concepts and applied that to the software development process. And now what's happened with that is we've come out of IT and continuing to use those tools and techniques into all functional areas in the business. So you have Agile marketing, Agile HR, Agile finance, Agile supply chain. And it's really about taking those tools and techniques and that mindset and evolving your organization into an ecosystem and a group of people who are comfortable with change and can maximize for change. So to drive that home, it's simply just a new way of working. It's the Agile mindset of value first, collaboration, decentralization, outcome-based metrics that drive behavior in an organization, combined with a set of Agile tools and techniques that change the way you actually do the work, whether it's Scrum or Kanban or continuous improvement or flow techniques. It's really just the combination of those two. And what we see a lot of times in organizations when we come in for transformation is they may be doing some of the tools and techniques, but their maturity might be a little lower on the mindset side, or vice versa. You come in on the mindset side and maybe their tools and techniques aren't really optimized to help with the flow or to remove the obstacles that need to be in place to optimize a full value chain. So, as I said, the manifesto is not new. It's coming up on its 20 years. And this is a set of values that drive the mindset, right? It's individuals and interactions over defined processes. It's working products and services over comprehensive documentation. It's that deep customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and it's responding to change over following a plan. So, a lot of times when I share the values with particularly, leaders in an organization, what they hear is, I'm not getting any documentation anymore, and I'm not following a plan anymore. And that's nothing could be further from the truth. There is value in each side of these values, but what we're saying is that we value one side more than the other. So we value the left more than we value the right. And the concept of Agile isn't throwing structure and frameworks out the window. It's about the concept around, if you know that everything about a value stream is nothing but change, why waste your time trying to make things fixed? Why spend, I'll use an IT example, why spend a year to develop requirements when you know those requirements are going to change by the time you develop it? That's the concept of focusing and preparing your organization and developing your processes with the idea that change is constant. Don't waste time if you know change is your constant. In addition to that, the manifesto laid out 12 principles, which is the conversation of working to satisfy your customer. A customer could be an external customer or internal customer. Creating an environment that welcomes change. It looks at delivering frequently in smaller chunks. That's the flow conversation. It's that working together, the trust and support conversation around psychological safety that gives you the ability to, and develops high performance teams that have confidence and mutual respect so that they can, fail forward as opposed to being afraid to speak up. It's the value of face-to-face. Even in COVID, the conversations that we're having via Zoom, face-to-face conversation where possible, the focus on working products and services, sustainable development, the relentless focus on continuous improvement, trying to maintain simple self-organizing team, and that's a decentralized discussion, and having a safe space for reflection and adjustment, where you have dedicated time to come back and look to improve as a team. So what we've seen when we work with clients, specifically in Agile Audit,
7:14 a.m.
excuse me, is you get better alignment with the business owners and the teams, and you manage expectations through the entire process. And through that alignment, you tend to see shorter cycles. We've seen, anything from, standard where they've taken 12 weeks before, cut down to 8 weeks. So we've seen significant decreases in cycles. And the prioritization, which we'll talk, I'm not going to steal Ian's thunder here. We're going to talk a lot about prioritization as we sort of move through the remainder of the deck, the value of the insights, the productivity improvements, which kind of comes into the sort of cycles, and then the quality to maintain the compliance, time, and budget that sort of builds in the quality of the process. So with that, we'll start with our first question. All right, I always like to give like a racetrack play-by-play here. Let's see what we've got. So what is business agility? So we've got a third of the folks in. Many folks feel like it's the ability to respond quickly to market changes. We got a tough race between how all businesses should operate and the ability to compete. 88% are in. All right, we're up to 90. Nice work. Honestly, guys, there's really not a wrong or right answer. I tend to say it's the ability to respond quickly to market changes. So that is technically the right answer, but all of these are actually a part of business agility. I do feel strongly in terms of how technology is impacting our businesses, how COVID and other environmental factors are in play. We need to think about agility in every aspect of our businesses in order to be able to quickly respond to market changes. I'm going to see if you make sure you guys can see the results. Gotcha. Perfect. All right. So with that, I kind of told you a little bit about what business agility is. Now I'm going to hand it over to Ian, or he's going to talk to you about how it applies to Agile Audit and more of the how.
Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, let's go on to the next slide then, and we'll just dive into this and see what we can do about applying principles of Agile to the audit area. So what you're looking at here is sort of a traditional Agile flow of work. And as Kristen pointed out, Agile really kind of started in the business, really more specifically IT side with DevOps, and that was where the genesis of this mindset and the manifesto and values and principles that she just walked through, where it all started, right? So it was about creating a way to deliver value. And if you think about what they call stories in traditional Agile, a story is really a piece of functionality in a code, in programming, delivering that adds value to an end user. So this is an illustrative flow of a project in Agile to develop, let's say, functionality related to IT systems and so forth. So you've got sort of stories or value that you want to create to your end users, and you've got a backlog of those things that you want to deliver. So pulling those together and prioritizing them is very key in Agile, and then you launch into a sprint activity. And a sprint is basically working on the stories, trying to bring that value to life for your end users. And a sprint is a time-boxed set of activities to deliver that value to your end users or customers. And it involves this concept of what they call the daily scrum, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But it's basically a high-frequency meeting between team members who are working on the sprint, as well as the folks that are the end users here. So Agile is a very, very collaborative approach. And this is the traditional way of doing it in IT. And what we've done here, in the end game here in IT is to deliver functionality. So we've taken all these concepts and said, well, what does this mean if you want to be Agile in other aspects of business or other processes? And so for Agile Audit, we've gone through an exercise of really taking these principles and this approach and saying, what does it look like in audit? And so let's go on to the next slide. Well, let me back up here first and say that if you think about mapping roles from traditional Agile DevOps type scenario to what you're doing in audit, you've got a product owner in traditional audit, you've got a Scrum team, which is your development team essentially, and you've got a team lead called a Scrum Master. Well, in Agile Audit, what we've done is translated that over to what does that look like in audit world? So your product owner is essentially your audit plan owner, and you can think of that person as your chief audit executive or director of internal audit. Whoever is the top internal audit person in the organization is going to be your audit plan owner. So they're basically setting the direction of the team and laying out what are the activities that team is going to work on in the next period. Your Scrum team in IT Dev, it's a development team. In audit, it's your Agile Audit team. So this is going to be your team. Maybe it's 3 to 5 people, could be plus or minus that depending on the situation and the organization. But this is your traditional audit team, right? So they're the ones that are out there conducting Agile Audit activities to address risks that, as we'll come to further in the discussion, it's all about tying back audit activities to address risks in the organization. And of course, that team is led by a leader. In DevOps, it's a Scrum Master. In audit, we call that person the audit lead. And so it's not that different from what you may be doing in your traditional audit shops with an audit team leader. However, in Agile ways of doing things, your lead is going to be someone who's much more like a coach, really, removing roadblocks from the audit team and allowing the team to do its best work. So there's a little bit different mentality that goes with doing things in an Agile way. And your team leaders are really there to bring out the best among the team. It's a much more or much less autocratic approach, you might say. And your team lead in Agile has a little bit different approach on things. Of course, they need to make sure that the team is working productively. And, as with any organization, they're going to escalate issues and deal with HR matters and so forth if that's has to be done. But it's much more about really being that coach, giving the team the tools and removing the roadblocks that might be inhibiting the team's progress in any way. All right, let's go on. So now we have, what does that flow look like in Agile Audit? And you can see how we've brought over the roles that we just described, or the key folks involved here, your product owner or CAE, your Scrum Master is your team lead, and your Scrum team is your audit team. Now, instead of talking about stories or functionality in traditional DevOps, now we're talking about everything tying back to risks. So you can see we've got objectives that tie in with risks. So risk 1, 2, 3, and then we're building an audit plan backlog so that everything that we're planning to do from an audit standpoint ties back to the risks. And that risk prioritization and backlog is constantly being reassessed. And we'll talk more about, what does constant mean? How frequently do we really expect this to be done in a practical sense? So when we start to build our audit sprint, and your audit sprint is basically your time-boxed internal audit activity. So it could be 2 to 4 weeks. It could be longer, it could be less, depending on the audit. But you're basically saying, okay, what are the risks that I'm going to address in this particular audit sprint activity? And we also bring over the concept of doing the daily scrum. So this is a high frequency meeting amongst the audit team. Could be daily, maybe not quite so frequent, depending on the situation and what works best. But we also want to be including our auditees where it makes sense. So oftentimes Scrum meetings will involve the auditees and the folks that we are having a lot of interaction with to conduct our audit activities. And there's a very high frequency update process. It's a very transparent process in the sense that we generally consider Agile Audit to be a method whereby there are no surprises, right? We're constantly keeping our auditees informed, and we're escalating findings and observations really almost in real time when we're working with them to make sure, are we looking at it right? Do we understand the issues here? Do we need to kind of reset course or deal with some factual corrections? So it's a very transparent process. And for that reason, we tend to get a lot of buy-in from the auditees because they're kind of at the table with us as we're working through it, right? And so, at the end of the day, what is our value or functionality delivered? Well, it's really a report, and we'll talk about what does report mean. Reporting is a tool to deliver insights, right? It's really about providing feedback to our auditees and giving them value about what we've seen and making good observations and recommendations to address the risks. Okay, let's move along. Okay, so elements of a program increment. So again, here we're really just kind of comparing for you what does some of this terminology look like in traditional Agile, where you've got a program increment, which is basically trying to time box some planning activities to deliver value to your end users. So again, this is the traditional terminology here. So this ties back to DevOps. Objectives are what you're trying to do, what business goals and technical goals are you trying to achieve in that program increment. And stories, again, is really about functionality. And the sprint is the tasks that the team will go through to develop and build that functionality. So now let's take this and make it applicable to audit. So what are we talking about? The program increment really maps over to the audit plan. And again, this is something that's going to be directed in large part, of course, consultation with audit committees. They'll have a say in this. But this is about planning out what are the activities that we want to include in our audit plan. And you'll notice here that we actually talk about quarterly planning. And here's why, because in Agile, we revisit this plan on a high frequency basis and really are constantly reprioritizing the risks and what we want to address in the upcoming period, which typically could be a quarter, could be 6 months, depending on the organization. But our horizon for what we're setting out to do becomes a lot shorter in Agile because we know things change a lot. And there was no better illustration of the need to be agile and the need to respond to change and address change than what happened last year with COVID-19. I mean, you can't understate, the impact that had on companies across the board. And, I've been involved with a lot of CAE roundtables, and obviously there was a lot of discussion about, what happened with COVID? How did you react to that? And what did it do to your audit plan? And as you would expect, people had to really pivot very rapidly when that happened. So Agile is about being prepared to do that. In terms of objectives, yeah, I mean, we're basically trying to, achieve whatever business goals and technical goals make sense to tie back into the risks and make sure that there's value provided to the organization. And the stories in Agile Audit become our actual risks. So everything is risk-based, as I said, and making sure that we're very focused on risks, and everything we do really needs to tie back to risks. And then the sprint becomes the audit activities that we embark upon to address those risks. So, it's going to depend on the situation and what the risks are, but we can bundle certain risks into one audit sprint, or maybe a risk is so significant that it warrants its own activity to just look at, one particular risk. So that's all something that the audit plan will address, looking at the risk backlog, and then figuring out how do we bucket these things in a way that will add the most value. Okay, we've got another polling question here. Did we read the question? What is an ideal risk assessment frequency? Okay. We're up to almost 90% responses here. Let's just give it another second. Okay. Okay, good answers. It's definitely weighted in the right direction. Continuous is ideally, that's where we'd like to be, right? But in terms of, from a practical standpoint, it's probably going to end up being more of a at least quarterly activity, although continuous risk assessment is wonderful. I mean, that's ideally what you want to get to. We're always reassessing and making sure that everything we do is going to be tying back to the highest risks in the organization. All right, let's go on to the next. Here we go, implementing Agile Audit. So how do we go about doing this? So, basically 3 large areas: planning, execution, reporting. And we have these same activities in traditional audits today, right? But the way that we do it in Agile is a little bit different. I mentioned, and you guys just responded to the question about risk assessment. That's going to be done on a very high frequency basis, at least quarterly. And from that risk assessment, we develop a plan, which is probably going to be a quarterly plan, may have a little bit longer horizon than that. But in the old days where we might do a risk assessment and build out a 2 or 3 year audit plan, that's really not likely the way we're going to do it in Agile. It's just too long a horizon, and we know that the likelihood of that plan sticking is almost nil in Agile, because that's, business risk just changes too frequently, and organizations overall are really not able to not reassess on a high frequency basis here. And then planning also involves the team. It's, again, it might be 3 to 5 people plus or minus, depending on what needs to be done. But you're going to have a fairly well-structured team, and you're going to always be looking at the skill sets on that team, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Execution, again, everything's tying back to risk. What are we going to have to do when we execute the audit? Iterative completion is, again, kind of tying back to this concept of the daily scrum, and really time boxing activities to make sure that we're sharing insights on an iterative basis back with our auditees, using that daily stand-up report. And then audit iteration, again, it's a lot more about transparency in our reporting out. And then in terms of more formalized reporting, we want to be able to provide the insights to management on demand. And we're also going to have quarterly reporting that is really going to be more suited to the audit committee, again, but we should be prepared to provide even our audit committees insights on pretty close to real-time basis. But we know that audit committees do like a little more polish on final quarterly updates and so forth. So that's something we'll factor into our reporting as well. And everything really, again, ties back to risk and control insights. Okay, so in looking at planning, you know, in the traditional audit method, you're talking about trying to audit the entity, right? So it could be based on business units, it could be based on geographies, but there's this concept that you have to touch everything over some period of time. And, you know, every portion of the enterprise probably has some risks, that is true. And you might be doing an annual risk assessment basis. Oftentimes, you know, it's towards the beginning of the year, you know, you're finalizing risk assessment and you're going to plan out, you know, 12 months of activity or even longer, as I said, 1 to 3 years in a lot of cases. And emerging risks may not be that well represented in traditional planning. Now, Agile, risk-based, right? Everything's tying back to the risk, and we're going to be focusing on business objectives and strategic risks. We're going to be doing this at least quarterly, and it's very collaborative. So we're talking to management, we're talking to senior executives, and we're learning from the other audit activities that we've already done. And that audit plan is really going to be developed with a quarterly time horizon. That's much more practical and something that we will expect to evolve every quarter. And we're always thinking about emerging risks as well. We want to make sure that we have visibility into that, or at least can anticipate. And we want to, you know, get the insights from our executives and our auditees and find out what are they seeing that we should be concerned with. Okay, so again, back to quarterly, right? So we know, as was well illustrated last year and even into the early days of this year, we live in a very unpredictable world, and risks, you know, do evolve and emerge. And so we always have to be prepared to do that frequent risk assessment and making sure that it's not necessarily about looking at every aspect of the entity across the board. We're going to be, you know, if there are low risk components of an entity that don't get audited because they're not risky, that's okay. So it's a little bit of a shift in that mindset. As long as we're tackling those big risk areas for the organization, we're going to be in a good place and we're going to be adding a lot of value. All right, let's go with another polling question. How often should the internal audit department be able to produce audit committee insight reports?
Mhm. All right, so we've got 80% in, and on demand and once per quarter are our top 2 contenders.
Perfect, perfect. So the official answer is on demand, but that's great. That's great. Folks are listening, right? So the ideas are, you know, you can understand how on demand would provide a lot of value, especially in this collaborative way of doing things. And, you know, in an agile audit world, what we prepare to the audit committee on demand, it should look professional, of course, but it's not going to have the depth and the, you know, the same structure as maybe what you are typically used to seeing in terms of quarterly audit reports now, because those take a long time to prepare. And reporting is really just a vehicle to deliver those insights. So that's another key way of thinking about how you report in Agile Audit. What's the purpose of the report? All right, let's go on. Okay, so risk assessment, it's this part doesn't change the how of how you do it, doesn't change that much from traditional audit, because you're always going to get insights from financial reporting sources around strategic objectives and risk statements. It's in every public filer's 10K, they have that. We interview senior management. We understand from them, what new initiatives are coming up, what do they think are risks in their areas of responsibility and so forth. And of course, from completed audits, we're going to have, insights from what we looked at there, but what were maybe some emerging risks that came out of the conversations that we had in our audits that we need to tie back to our plan for looking forward. What additional risks are out there that we really need to make sure that we're addressing moving forward. And okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so if you think about traditional risk assessment, as we've discussed, it's very much entity-based. You might be looking at a business unit or a department. In this example, it's human resources, and you're kind of going to drill down into that particular department because, it's on the plan. You feel like there's maybe an obligation to touch HR because maybe it hasn't been audited in a few years and it's time, right? And you might consider some of the various risk aspects of that department's strategic operational risk and some of their particular processes. Now, here's an example of what we might put together in Agile auditing. This is going to be a lot more tied in with the objectives of the organization overall and the risks that we'll look at, in terms of how they may impact strategy and what the organization is trying to do, and how we look at what the processes are and what the risks associated with the processes are. It's much more tactical in the sense that we're not thinking about entities here. We're not thinking about a department. We're thinking about much more specific activities that if they're not well controlled, it may in fact have an impact on the strategic objectives of the company. So that's what it's really all about, is making sure that everything we do ties back to the risks. So in terms of execution, in traditional auditing, we're looking at a process more end-to-end. We oftentimes run into roadblocks in traditional auditing about, there could be delays in receiving documentation. You could have scope creep. That's a very common one. And, tangential activities that you may be tempted to embark upon because of something that comes up in interviews, and maybe it leads you down a path, but the risk might not really be that high. It could be a low risk item. Sometimes manager review can be an issue and a bottleneck. Oftentimes there's disagreements with auditees, especially if we're not having a lot of communication throughout the process. The last thing that you want in Agile is any kind of surprises, and we work to make sure that that doesn't happen. But in traditional auditing, that could be an issue because it's not as collaborative. There's limited involvement by the business owners. And in Agile, again, everything's going back to risk. We're having the daily stand-up meetings or the scrum, and we'll invite auditees to that to make sure that we understand the material that they're providing to us. We can offer up insights and observations almost in real time, and it really helps reduce any kind of delays or bottlenecks, and certainly avoid surprises. And we're really starting to give the feedback and recommendations to our auditees as we execute the audit. So they're not going to be surprised at the end. And really the report out at the end of the audit almost becomes more of a formality. They'll know what's in the report because it's been discussed all along and throughout the process. All right, let's move along. Right. So in considering daily Scrum activities, this is what it looks like in the traditional Agile world for a DevOps type situation where, it's a high frequency meeting, probably once a day, 15, 20 minutes, talking about, what is going on in the sprint? Are there any problems? And really looking at the story backlog, right? Story, again, is functionality that's trying to be delivered. What needs to be done? What are we currently working on, and what's already been completed? And so we take this concept over to audit on the next slide. And again, now instead of talking about stories, we're talking about risks. So we have a backlog of risks that we need to address in our Agile audit approach. What do we need to do? What have we done? And what's completed in terms of addressing those risks in that audit sprint activity. But the Scrum concept is still there and still very relevant for the audit team to meet. Once a day, 15, 20 minutes, talk about what's going on. And as I said, oftentimes we're going to include members from the management team or the auditee to make the process as transparent as possible.
Ian, I want to add just a little bit here. The Scrum board, also referred to as Kanban board for those of you guys who have lean in your backgrounds. The reality of this board, of moving them from stage to stage, from backlog to doing and done, is a conversation around flow. And so what you're really looking for as a part of this discussion is trying to move those risk items through to do, doing and done in the most effective manner. And this is where you're breaking it down into those smaller chunks so that they can move through more effectively and you can maximize your time and effort. And so this is the visualization technique that many folks in Agile Audit are taking on, because you get a nice visual representation for the entire team to be able to see what's going on and understand where they are in this stage and status and process. And it just becomes a really good tool to be used as a part of your transformation to Agile Audit.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. Thank you, Kristen. Okay, so we've touched on this a little bit too in terms of reporting. Reporting is really a tool to deliver insights, we like to say in Agile world. So in traditional audit committee reporting, we could be providing an audit plan update to the audit committee. Issues might be categorized on a trending dashboard. Audit committee meetings may only happen 4 times a year, sometimes less than that, depending on the organization. And it's a lot of work, right? In traditional auditing, preparing a glossy looking, fancy, very professional report to the audit committee only 4 times a year, it takes a lot of effort. Now in Agile, we still need to communicate with the audit committee, right? But we want to be in a position to do it much more so on demand, as we've said. And so we'll work on creating templates and reporting mechanisms that will be able to be prepared a lot faster, a lot easier to do, and really provide insights to that audit committee about what is going on. What are we seeing with regard to these risks? What observations and recommendations are we making as an audit function to add value to the organization? So it's really about just being in a position to do it a lot more frequently and really delivering insights and not worrying about a massive deck 4 times a year. And then of course, audit reporting to management and auditees. In Agile, what we want to do is through our daily Scrum process and just our overall approach to be highly collaborative is be in a position to produce interim reports, right? So we're going to want to have updates with our auditees, and maybe it's 45-minute meetings every couple of weeks, in addition to the daily Scrum activities where we're going over what are we seeing, and also talking about the process regarding what's going well. Do we need help from the auditees to execute any of the steps, or do we need to get their help to obtain information, setting up interviews, etc. And then of course we're talking about the issues we're seeing, and we're starting to make those recommendations known and transparent to them so that they can start providing back to the audit team their responses and what remediation steps are they going to take to address the issues and so forth. And at the end of the audit, we're still going to have a final audit report, but there should be no surprises. It should be fairly straightforward pulling that together, and it really almost becomes a formality at that point, because everything that is in that final audit report, the auditee should already be aware of it, and they would have had those discussions with us, and they're probably already at that point working on their remediation. So what is the internal audit department's main product?
All right, we got 75% in. Come on, guys, let's get over 90.
Okay, 87% looks good. Final answer, audit committee insights got the majority. So fantastic. So that's exactly what we're looking for with this question, is providing insights to the audit committee is really what we want to deliver to audit committees, and the reporting is a tool to do it. But the insights are the value. That's the value that the audit team is adding here. All right, let's go to the next slide. So final product, you know, we've really kind of covered most of this already. We want to be able to provide summarized information back to them. But of course, in our on-demand mindset, much of this we may have already even communicated before you get to a formal audit committee meeting. Okay, so in terms of Agile audit maturity, right, there's different levels of maturity. It's a journey, we say, to kind of go from traditional audit to Agile auditing. And we've got sort of 4 stages: basic, enabled, strategic, adaptive. And, you know, through a structured process and really kind of diving into these key concepts around porting Agile thinking over to audit, you can go through this journey, right? And move through, you know, some of the basic things where, you know, maybe you're just starting to do your risk assessment more frequently, all the way up to, you know, getting more strategic and adaptive in how you adopt Agile concepts here. And by the time you get to the more mature states of being adaptive, you're probably going to be deploying technology, right? We see technology is also a key enabler of being more Agile. And so there's tools like data analytics, and there's RPA solutions that you can deploy in audit functions to help automate some of the testing and continuous monitoring, and these types of things that really do enable high frequency insights to be provided to auditees and audit committees. So I guess we'll pause there and see what questions we might have, Kristen.
If you don't mind, everyone, we open your chat, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We have myself and Ian on the call, but we also have a few other of our colleagues here to answer questions. There was a question that came through earlier before the session around RPA tools for SOX compliance. So if you want to answer that one.
Yeah, there are tools out there. There's a lot of RPA software tools out there. And they can certainly be deployed to help with internal audit and SOX activities. We actually have been doing quite a bit at RGP to take some of that RPA technology and deploy it in the SOX space, especially around controls like in, IT general controls, because RPA tends to work best on high frequency controls that are very much rules based. So some of the things that you typically do in SOX around ITGC, such as user access provisioning and deprovisioning, lend themselves quite well to RPA type solutions. So it's certainly something that you know, people are really looking to leverage these days.
Christine, to answer your question, yes, the handout will be made available. Patricia will send that out after the session, as well as the recorded session will be provided on their website.
Have you seen the use of software systems for SOX controls testing? Yes, Karen, good question. So as I mentioned, RPA solutions are being deployed more and more for helping with SOX controls testing. Automated controls assurance is what we call it. And you know, we've had a lot of success with that, and there's a lot of interest out there to deploy these RPA solutions for that type of control testing.
So from Christine, how would you develop Agile auditing if you're a junior in a department of 2? Department of 2, it's more than 1. So the way I look at that, it's really about maybe starting in that basic space in terms of thinking about the ceremonies, how you engage with your business partners, and thinking about putting in the daily stand-ups, the sort of interim reporting, and starting small and building the audit team is building the group as an audit team, and then sort of moving from there. That's where I would start. Will a less formalized Agile audit approach be accepted by regulators?
I'm sorry, what was that question?
Will a less formalized Agile audit approach be accepted by regulators who critically review audit work papers and reports?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure many of you are familiar that there's the IIA standards, which a lot of internal audit departments try to achieve and will periodically get a peer review or a QAR performed to see if they're actually in compliance. So yes, you don't lose, you're not detaching yourself from the IIA standards when you go to Agile. In fact, I just performed a QAR for one of our clients that had flipped from traditional audit methods to Agile last year. And absolutely, they went through and were able to demonstrate their compliance with all the standards, even using the Agile approach. So the great thing about the Agile approach we're discussing here for audit is, there are elements of basic IT DevOps Agile that don't port over as well as the ones we've discussed today. So you don't have to bring every aspect of Agile over to audit. It's more about the mindset, as we've said, high frequency risk assessment, and really just the collaborative approach to the audit sprints that we're talking about. But all of those activities can certainly be done in a way that would satisfy regulators and pass a external quality assessment, or old term is QAR, right, to demonstrate compliance with standards.
And I just want to make sure that, Chris, we answered your question with that. I think feeling stuck in auditing to the regulatory requirements, I think there's an opportunity here. It's really just about talking to your audit board and everyone to make sure that there's a buy-in and talking to them about the benefits. Okay, well, so with that, thanks to everyone for joining. My name's Kristen, as you know, Ian's here. We also have in the Tampa area Brian Cox, which is our Director of Client Development. The contact information is available in the deck. In addition, we have a blog that we put together around Agile Audit. There's a link to that if you're interested in reading some recent thought leadership from us. We also are including some key links in here for sort of Agile and action, some recent published articles that we find are really important in terms of thinking about Agile and agility in your organization. Oh, Denise, it's Denise that's going to post that. Denise, I'm sorry I called you by the way. That was terribly sorry. My apologies.
That's okay. I'll distribute this to all the participants within the next day, along with Ian and Kristen's contact information. And also we'll make the video available within the next couple of days. Anything else, folks?
Great. Well, feel free to reach out to us if there's any questions about the material. So thanks for tuning in today. Glad you were able to join.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.